it's also not true, so.
I was gonna say.
So it's a double split. I guess we might as well start. This is the spoiler panel. So, can anybody, can you in the back hear me? Because.
Just realized I'm
Okay. If you can't hear, let us know. But I think
I mean, the rest of us have mics.
I have one too, but it's way over there. And they tell you not to move.
Don't touch anything.
Spoiler, they're electrified.
Yeah, it makes for an exciting panel.
Yeah. Nice.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is start off. I'll have the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. So, Graham, you want to start? Oh, no, you're Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan Crowe. I am a blogger, map feed, snake whisperer, and cat photographer, apparently. And I spoil myself on a regular basis by choice.
My name is Gavin Grant, and I'm the publisher of Small Beer Press, and publish an occasional zine, Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet. And I don't really like things to be spoiled. I know it's not a sane position in a world where we have the internet, in a world where there are no spoilers. You know, but when my wife says, "Hey, did you hear the Iron Man dies in the Avengers 4?" I'm like, "Well, I guess we don't have to go and see that."
Hi, I'm Kate Nepveu. I read things, sometimes I write about them. I believe in enthusiastic consent for spoilers as well as sex.
Hi, I'm Graham Sleight. I'm a critic for Lotus and Washington Post and other places, and I think the most outraged reaction I ever had to a review of mine was when I reviewed Ian Vance's 2006 novel Matter, and in passing I gave away the ending of his 1987 novel Consider Fleabag. And this was completely upsetting to the reader who left a very outraged comment. I did a solo talk the other day, and I did say, as Greg will testify, that I was about to spoil the plot of Hamlet. No one seems to object.
And
They will die.
They usually do. I'm Gayle Surrette. I'm the editor and now publisher of SF Review, which is SFREVU. We have a problem with spelling, I guess. And I write reviews as well as edit and all that other stuff. But on my private blog, I do things that are of other interests, like review all the Jane Austen follow-ons and everything. And I've gotten complaints from my readers saying, "Don't do that anymore." And so I took a break. I'm going to get back to it. And this panel is books that deserve to remain unspoiled. And it says, in a 2013 review of Joyce Carol Oates' The Accused, Stephen King stated, "While I consider internet-fueled concern with spoilers rather infantile, the true secret of well-made fiction deserved to be kept. How does spoiler-acquired knowledge change your reading of fiction? Are some books more deserving of going unspoiled than others? If so, what criteria do we apply to determine those works?" I thought we might start with, I found a quote from, if I can find it in my notes, which I have, Roger Ebert, that said, "In the case of some films, even to hint that there's a surprise is to reveal too much." How much is a spoiler? When do you become a spoiler? When do you have to give away to be spoiled?
The problem with spoilers is that I think there's not a very good clear-cut definition. I can remember, has anyone, just to flip over to movies, has anyone seen the original Charles Laughton Witness for the Prosecution? Yeah, you'll know so you know that at the end it says, "Due to the shocking nature of this movie, please do not tell your friends."
So is this the adaptation of the Agatha Christie play?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So
Is that for the play?
Yeah.
Is it different?
Having not seen the play, I can't speak to that, I would guess. And there are certain things that I think, there's a problem, plot twists are one thing, but I have seen people get upset about spoilers for things that I would not have associated with surprises or intricacies in plots. I've seen people complain about divulging details of the Man in the High Castle. I've seen people complain about Olympics results. Because apparently in this country, they're taped with a drama and not news. That sort of thing. So is there then, I wonder, should there a distinction be made between don't tell me anything and there are certain things that should not be divulged?
Anyone have a question?
Can I throw out an alternate perspective, which I have to say I don't agree with, but this is from James Wood, arguably, I guess, one of the 2 or 3 most prominent critics of literary fiction at the moment, and he has a piece on Ian McEwan in his new book, The Fun Stuff, in which he says, and talking about McEwan as someone who does this a lot, I dislike strong narrative manipulation, and therefore deliberately try to spoil plot surprises in my reviews.
Is that lancing the boils of tension?
I guess. And I guess what that opened up to me is, I say, I really don't agree with him, but this goes back to Gayle's original question. There may be works in general, where there is more or less dependency on plot surprises for readerly pleasure. And I think that, therefore, saying what happens in the narrative of a book may be more or less damaging depending on the nature of the work.
Well, of course, but that's because the question of a spoiler is a question about, inevitably it's subjective because it's about what are you spoiling? You're spoiling the reader or the watcher's experience. And everyone's going to value things differently. So you have to set a sort of mass baseline if you are a reviewer or a discusser for a mass audience. One interesting thing on that was all the mainstream reviews I saw of Iron Man 3 did not even say that there was a twist. And I had thoroughly planned not to go, I had actively planned to avoid seeing it given the publicity, which was also very thoroughly not hinting that there was a twist. Then I saw people I know who were talking about it with their friends and said, look, this is a spoiler, but it's the kind of spoiler you would want to know because it might change the way you feel about the movie. And I read it, I'm like, holy shit, I have to see this. And it's actually my 2nd or 3rd favorite of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, whether the movie reviewers, like the New York Times and whatever, were right to not hint that there was more to the movie than the commercials and so forth would lead you to believe, that's up to them. But it's a question about what is your audience. And so people who know what their audience is, you have different responsibilities depending on who you're talking to.
It's a bit funny we keep going to movies because I think they are a lot more common currency,
Yeah.
and they're a lot easier to spoil. And I find watching trailers for movies that I would like to see full of spoilers. If you see someone do some action thing, that action thing is going to happen in the last third
Well,
of
not
the
necessarily.
movie.
That was really interesting because I actually put myself on a moratorium for the most recent Captain America movie after a little while because I realized I was getting tired of all the footage released. But if you go, I actually went back and looked at the trailers after I saw it, and there are a bunch of scenes in the trailers that did not make it in the movie and were shot like they were new. Like there's a scene in a trailer where one of the characters is standing over a covered body on a gurney. That shot is not in the movie. You see the person's face. And there are other scenes that I don't know if they cut them out or if they were just. I suspect they were almost created wholesale because the makeup is different in a way to create more ambiguity for people who aren't familiar with the storyline already. So I don't know if many more trailers are going to be doing that these days to be not actively misleading, but more obfuscatory on purpose. But actually, because I don't have time to see that many movies, but I think that's actually really interesting that, this
It's
is,
a technique, a new
Yeah.
technique.
yeah.
I think it's interesting that you bring up that we're talking about movies, and I think there might be a reason for that. I think that the movies are much more distilled plot than other forms of culture. I mean, one of the, on a panel yesterday, I think it was the Better Reader panel. One of the arguments that came out was sort of a complaint that reading for plot was being privileged over reading for other purposes, reading for other things. So that might, that might be. I mean, when we talk about spoilers in movies, finding out what there's, a movie is pretty much plot.
I haven't thought about that when I've been talking.
Well, I mean, sorry. Go
I'll
ahead.
let you go, or
Very briefly, I think the other sort of £1,000 gorilla in this discussion at the moment is Game of Thrones. That so much of the particular appeal of that, both in its book and its TV incarnation, is that the plot subverts a lot of the expectations you have, particularly about who lives and who doesn't.
my question I was going to throw out next is, how long does a spoiler have an expiration date? You brought it up that you got complaints because you spoiled a book that was many years before. And Game of Thrones goes into that because those who read the book knew that event that was in the thing. That was a big spoiler because everybody was talking about it, was in the book that was years before. Is there a time, is a spoiler for till the movie gets out of theaters, or the book is 10 years old, or 15, or 20, or
I
100?
thought this question comes up a lot, and I think I reject its premise, because I mean, spoilers are subjective, and everyone has their own definition of what a spoiler is. Then it's entirely impossible to set this out. I mean, to a certain extent, spoiler alerts mean don't give me a chance to read it first, or give me a chance to see it first. And to a certain extent, whatever implicit in that is the sense, that I have the right to decide whether I want to see it, and that means that we'd have to put a time limit on that. And it's also only relevant in the context of public discussion of this stuff.
In fiction, it does seem like the spoiler zone is hardcover publication, and then by the time paperback publication comes along, if a book is doing hard soft, the spoiler is done. You've had your chance. You know some kind of gestalt of the plot. The twists are there, and they're often in the new jacket copy or in the blurbs taken from reviews. So if you want to read it unspoiled, you have to read the hardcover.
On the other hand, I mean, I've had discussions about Rosemary Christine's Steerswoman book. I forget that the first one, I think, was published in the 80s. And I said, sorry?
87, I think. I might be wrong.
I came to them much later,
Yeah.
so, but thank you. And I've said exactly the same thing. I mean, technically, you might want to find this out for yourself. And this is actually, I think, an example of something that's sort of a spoiler, that's a spoiler, but it's not plot, really. It's more world building. A lot of the fun of this is finding it out along with the character. On the other hand, if this is a kind of thing that might interest you, here's a spoiler about something that is revealed partway through the first book, that things are not the way they seem, and here's what it is. Because there's 4 books in total now, and not when there may be more. And I also think another thing that's relevant is how much of an overall work you're talking about when you're revealing something. So again, there's a lot of fun, not necessarily on plot, but also in that's a particularly good example of world building, that you're going on the journey along with the characters. It can be very rewarding, but there's also a lot more to go along on a journey with, if that's what it takes to get you started. They're awesome books, you should read them.
Any other comment on that part? Okay. I think that you touched on it a little. If the book comes out, if you read, there's the whole discussion of do you read the book before you see the movie or see the movie before you read the book? And does just, no matter which way you do it, does really, is it spoiling the enjoyment or the engagement with the second of the two items? Whether you do book first or movie first, does it really spoil your engagement or enjoyment of the second item?
Let me try to throw something out there. There are parts of the Lord of the Rings I can pull from memory, and yet and so.
Are any of those parts of the songs? Would you say?
Alas. But so going into the movies is, okay, let me just do a sidebar. There was a psychological study that came out a little while ago that said that actually tested people whether or not spoilers may ruin their experience. So they're surprised they found that people who had, and they tested it across a few genres, including mysteries, and they said that spoilers actually improved their enjoyment of the work, like if they had spoiled. And I think one of the things, since we're talking about movies, is that when you go and watch something that has a lot of visual information thrown at you at once, if you don't have to pay attention to the plot, and then you can pay attention to other things. Lord knows Lord of the Rings movies and plot and what it does with the books. That's another issue. So that you can pay attention to the costuming and the effects and the acting, such as it is, or all the other things that make up a work other than plot. And I find myself that that I can only absorb so much at once, especially at 24 frames a second, and so. So when you're coming to something with a book, having read the book or knowing what's about to happen at this particular wedding, or you can still enjoy it because you can enjoy possibly with greater effect all the non-plot aspects of the work. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and that goes into something, the book versus movie question, and that also goes into my reaction to Stephen King's quote, which I find really peculiar coming from King, and also kind of internally self-contradictory. But there are some works, if the only thing going for a surprise is that it's a surprise, if there's no pleasure to be had in rereading or rewatching, and seeing how it's constructed to lead up to that, then sure, I guess you could say they deserve to be spoiled insofar as you can say, this comes out of nowhere and it's lousy. And it's cheap, it's not earned, that's...
And my Shyamalan.
Well, that's actually really interesting, but, okay. But this goes back to the book versus the movie question. I mean, first there is necessarily going to be some tension, plot tension in how are things going to be adapted the same way or not, what changes are going to be made to suit one genre over the other. But there's also, if you enjoy, obviously you're not going to get one if you didn't enjoy the first one, so presumably you'll have the pleasure of seeing, appreciating more detail or different aspects that are the strengths of a different genre. So I think that, like for instance, The Hunger Games, the things I like, what I understand about the books, I think I probably wouldn't like as well as I like what the movies so far have done, because I like the broader perspective, and I think the first-person narration would feel kind of claustrophobic. So I'm deliberately waiting on, or I may never read them, I haven't decided yet, but that's also partly because other people have talked about it in general terms, and so I knew, was able to compare and contrast that. But that's because I know the genres have different strengths and weaknesses, and what I liked about one in this case doesn't translate over.
I suppose the other example that springs to mind both as book and, in fact, as TV and movie, is Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy from Le Carre. And I was thinking about that in the context of this panel, something that I first read as a book, and then saw a TV and then the movie. It would be incredibly difficult, I think. The book is about a mole hunt within the British intelligence community. I think it's incredibly difficult to give a rounded apprehension of what that book is about, unless you, in some respects, speak to who the mole is revealed to be, 20 pages from the end of it, and say, well, actually, this works architecturally with the whole lot of the rest of the book. And I think one of the things that the film in particular was really good at was anticipating that. One of the pleasures of the film was seeing how that was sort of laid in advance. I think reviewing it on first publication, you would probably have to have just hinted in that direction and say, well, is this book about Britain and empire and the loss of empire and this peculiar all-male environment in which this activity has been, this intelligence work has been done, and you just have to leave those hints there in the hope that someone would come back and read the review after they've finished the book and say, oh yeah, that was what they were reading.
Oh yeah, half the time I don't read reviews until after I'm done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Question, is there a review versus criticism issue here? In
I
this-
have to.
No, I mean, in the sense that, in the sense that a review is sort of to inform whether you want to see it or read it, and the criticism is to talk about it afterward.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. You're quite right. I apologize for my knee-jerk reaction.
I understand.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to get to that, but this
Okay.
question, does anybody want to comment on it? You want to talk more about it?
Well, if a review is basically sort of a consumer service to say, should you buy this book? Should you watch this? Should you consume this item?
Is this your kind of thing?
Then I think there would be a different rule about how much to reveal. You need to reveal enough to say, is this worth your time? But if you're going to then turn around and say, we are going to discuss some of the themes present in this book,
Right, obviously.
then I think a different set of rules would apply.
Yeah, and I think I don't quite accept the premise of a review narrowly as a consumer service.
Okay.
I think it can be a little broader than that.
And a corollary to that, in the case of your experience, Graham, that if you're going to review a book in a series,
Yeah.
that it would be fair game. It would be fair game to talk about what happened in previous books.
Right, but it would be nice if you said, one of the review sites I do regularly skim says, this is a review of book 2. We necessarily have to talk about book 1. If you haven't read book 1, you should stop now and go look at a review of book 1. And that's, that's fine. The particular criticism thing I wish I would die in a fire is scholarly introductions to works that discuss the entire work and then put that at the beginning. Because if you are an innocent child and you have not yet learned this practice and you are accustomed to start reading on page 1, you are in for some sad times before you realize that in fact you need to skip those things and find the first chapter and not the first page.
We read the same reprint classics series when we were kids, Penguin or Oxford or something like that, and you're sitting there going, but this is telling me all about the story, but it's boring. When does it start?
I'm lucky enough to write introductions to some reissues in the UK, Gallant's SF and Fancy ones, and I do try really hard not to spoil explicit plot
Or you could
details.
just say, if you haven't read the book yet, this is where you should stop. And that would be okay. I would be all right with that. It's just, again, consent. Your reader should be consenting to, the discussion, that you're implicitly having.
Okay. That brought to mind something, and that wasn't one of my questions, and now I got interested and forgot. What I was going to talk about, or ask about, is we're talking so far about sort of straight narration, but in mystery, there's a lot of times, mysteries are usually whodunit, but occasionally you get one where you know who the murderer is in chapter 1, probably in the first couple of chapters, and the whole book is about how it happened. That happens less often in science fiction or fantasy, but I have read a couple of those types. So, does the spoiler thing still work when you're talking about a book where you know from page 3 or 4 or 10 who did it, or
I'm not sure.
what the big event is?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean.
I think that those books are structured so differently that spoilers don't actually work with that. That is it's kind of a taking apart of one type of fiction, the whodunit. So if you take away that question and then look around at everything else, spoilers don't work with that, because you know everybody's going to say, well, obviously, once Gayle murdered that person on the panel, these are the things that happen. Everybody is
Stop, put it on YouTube.
Yeah, but I mean,
All the phones come out.
surely the point of the book is why Gayle murdered me or Gavin or I mean, so isn't there something to be learned after that, or else what's the point of the book? I mean,
Usually it's the twisty way that it happens.
sure. Well,
That all of the events that lead up to that thing that
The way that the we hope sociopath and not normal human person has committed this and done it so smartly that we're all just like, oh, how did that happen? I don't know. I have read books like that, but most mysteries still do seem to be more rocketing through to the end. And one of the things I find funny about this is I don't read too many mysteries because I don't like people getting killed. I think it's very odd that that's a form of entertainment. But my wife will read the last chapter or two, and then she'll go and read the book because she wants to see how the book is structured to get to where it's going. So we often, our discussions of
She's looking for guns on hand pieces.
kind of,
Yeah.
and our discussions of books that she's read can often be along very short. Would I like that? Yes or no? Because she will have a very good idea, and she will know that if she goes much further, I'll be like, spoiled it. Don't need to read that.
I now can't remember who it was. I want to say Virginia Woolf, but it was almost certainly not. Someone a bit like Virginia Woolf always said that she loved reading biographies, and she always read the last chapter first to see if it was a sort of interesting depth. And if it was, then that would justify going to read the whole thing.
well, that's kind of a hard, because your death is not much in your control a lot of the times. It's kind of a high standard to lead what somebody's life.
I went to see which biography she recommends.
Wow.
So, I mean, we all have to be interestingly dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. But that actually, I'm sorry. Did you want to?
No.
The thing about Game of Thrones and interesting deaths, there are times when I actually think, and I was in Wheel of Time fandom for a long time too, so I've seen this as well, that a creator's awareness of an audience's hunger for shocking plot twists that could be considered spoilers can be sometimes, I think, detrimental to the ongoing work. I stopped reading Song of Fire and Ice in book 2 because I couldn't keep up with all the characters, which was kind of funny when book 3 came around. But in Wheel of Time, a lot of us felt that there was one particular thing that didn't seem like all that. Maybe two things. It didn't seem like all that big deals, but it sort of felt like Jordan was kind of stringing us along just because it had turned into this kind of toxic dialogue with the fandom, as opposed to there are authors who have ongoing series that I feel like their books are ongoing dialogues with their fandom, like Stephen Roost, who's in his next book saying, oh yeah, you caught me in a continuity error. Here's how I'm going to fix it. But. So I think that I don't think that necessarily the audiences are wrong when someone has set up a work structure, that starts out like Game of Thrones or The Wheel of Time. I don't think that the audience is wrong or to react to the way that's been set up. But I sort of wish that maybe the creators would shut off the internet for a little while, or they're writing or something. I'm not sure what the remedy here is, and that's easy for me to say because I don't write. But because the spoiler thing is a conversation not only with reviewers and critics and audiences, but also creators sometimes, I think that that's a dynamic that can go really weird in different ways.
We're talking about, I I was thinking about a book before this panel and say, is this book possible to spoil? And it's not like an epic fantasy series or plot driven. The book I thought it was Gene Wolfe's Peace. I mean, and it is the sort of book where you sort of have to finish it, and you finished it, and you could still be spoiled. And then someone explains it to you, and you say, "Oh, I got to read it again." And I picked on that one partly because I read it and I didn't understand what was going on, and then someone explained it to me, and I didn't think, well, does the explanation make it? Does knowing that going in make a difference to my enjoyment of the work, and does not knowing that having finished it? I mean, because there's spoiling and then there's spoiling, and there's finding out what happens, and then there's understanding. And I'm wondering if we're limiting the framework by talking about plot-driven series and maybe things adapted for TV and movies.
Well, there are books that it's useful to go in with scaffolding. Like, if I'm going to recommend John M. Ford's Dragon Waiting to people, I'm going to say, this is a book that starts out like a different book every chapter for the first 3 or 4 chapters. And then there's a section where they all come together, which I have still never understood, but you read it for the character bits and not the plot bit. And then it all comes together, and it turns out that it would be really useful at this point to have read The Daughter of Time by Josephine Day. And that does. Sorry, what?
I have read that. Now I can go read that book.
I've actually, yeah. Well, I did it in the reverse order, and the Daughter of Time is Josephine Tay having a character detecting Richard III's alleged murder of the princess in the Tower. That's a very interesting book. It has its flaws, but it sort of goes through this sort of Shakespeare and the different historical theories about that, which makes the weight given to events in The Dragon Waiting make a lot more sense for someone who wasn't that familiar with history. But that's a scaffolding. That doesn't tell you why the princess ended up dead in this alternate history or anything like that. But this is a difficult book in some ways, or I haven't read Peace, but this is a difficult book for whatever reason. You know, here's some things that might be useful to be aware of, so you know it's your kind of thing, or so you're sort of, you know, you can sort of prepare yourself, pack usefully for your journey.
Sorry.
Yeah, no.
There's a more general point, I think, coming out of that, and also out of Peace, which is the equipment you go along on the journey with anyway. And so if you have read, say, Flann O'Brien, The Third Policeman, or Neil Barrett, The Hereafter Gang, and you go into Peace, you may be equipped to say, okay, well, this is of a piece with the others. If more generally, if you are equipped with experience in a genre, and you look at, say, Gene Wolfe's book, The New Sun, you may be able more easily to read through the surface to, okay, this is the trope that he's actually using but disguising in this ancient yet modern world. And there is a sense in which having that genre equipment in your head already gives you a different approach to non-overt things in books.
Yes.
So we can distinguish then between spoiling and explaining.
Or giving you the tools
Right.
for the journey.
Yeah. And there are always people who, I have 2 roles in my personal online spaces, which are no unsolicited advice and no unsolicited spoilers, and I regard them kind of as the same sort of thing, which is get your nose out of my business unless I ask for it. And so I think, you know, so tools and journey, or there's always the kind of person who wants to micromanage every aspect of your life, which isn't actually their business. So I think that's a continuum, the metaphorical continuum we're talking about here.
Now, the topic for the thing suggested asked, are there books that should not be spoiled? You talked about books that it would be hard to spoil because they sound like the books that you would reread as you change and you get more information and more tools in your toolbox of reading. But are there books that are written such that they just should not be spoiled because everyone should have that chance to to take the enjoyment and the engagement and the journey themselves.
Well, let me give one example, since we're going to be honouring her, I think, in here shortly, which is Shirley Jackson's Lottery story, admittedly rather than book. But if you were to say to someone before they read that, oh, by the way, this is what happens on the last page, you are in a significant sense robbing them of the experience of that story.
Except that, I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I think that one also runs into the problem of, after a certain period of time, a certain level of canonicity,
Yes.
I guess,
Yeah.
that it's sort of, you know, after a certain number of decades and a certain amount of critical discussion, it sort of passes into
It's
cultural knowledge
yeah, it's
anyway.
deep cultural knowledge.
Yeah.
People start picking up stones, people understand what we're talking, you know, the
Right.
reference.
I mean, even things like, you can find, I don't know if anyone here watching Animaniacs, but you can find some really weird ass spoilers in Animaniacs. I mean, there are things, excuse my language, I'm sorry, I saw a small child come in there.
She doesn't care.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you can find, there are jokes in there that are referring to movies that were old before I was born. I mean, but yeah, that's just assumed it's just assumed that Rosebud and Heart of Darkness is all sort of common reference even for 5-year-olds or maybe for their long-suffering parents. I mean, I think the first one that comes to mind in terms of, no, actually, I'm going to go with a less common one. I figured someone would say use of weapons, so I'm going to go with a less common one, which is Stephen Bruce's Aguiar, which I think has been reprinted relatively recently, although with an unfortunate cover. Because for me, that one's delightful because it's it's about the narrator, and it's about appreciating the form of the unreliable narration and appreciating the perfection of how it's in form of a diary, how it's only the things that the character would actually write in the diary and the things that are left unsaid because the character's writing for themselves, and you wouldn't say that in a diary. And then understanding, so that's, you know, that's the one that comes to mind, is the one where I really hate to spoil that admiring of the craft. On the other hand, you know, if you know that going in, I guess you could, you know, it doesn't ruin it because there's the appreciation of the craft going in, and also it makes the first page, you know, you can appreciate the impact of the first page instead of having to go back at the end. But it was so cool, you know, that's my knowledge. It was so cool. It's also a lot shorter than Use of Weapons.
Very recent novel by Karen Joy Fowler, We're All Completely Beside Ourselves. Before it was published, there was much back and forth whether a plot point would be in the jacket copy, and there were many people talking to her publisher, Putnam, saying it changes the book, whether you say this or you don't, you will get to a certain point in the book. And you know, so at this point, anyone who has not read the book is going, okay, and there's a spoiler in it, so I feel like if I go like this, they'll say, oh, the spoiler's here in that book. If I go like that, it's there in the book. But I've told people to read the book without reading the jacket copy. But it doesn't matter because, you know, the book has been out for, say, a year, and in your group of friends, someone will have probably read it. It will be part of that group knowledge.
Yeah.
The spoiler kind of disappears.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I read that book, and I think I read the library copies was the paperback, which spoils it. And I mean, I knew it coming in, and I looked at, when I read it, I thought this is not a capital S spoiler in the sense of you know, to use witness for the prosecution as the archetype. You know, the Sixth Sense, Luke, I am your father, or spoiler. You know, this is not that. This is not what we mean when we talk. You know, when we talk about this sort of thing. I thought that was overstated.
Can I just throw out another example, which may not so directly answer your question, but I recently reread Great Bear Zeon, which is a 1985, something like that, which is a big blockbuster alien artifact arrives in Earth orbit novel, in which almost all of the big science fictional revelations happen in the first 100 pages and are described or at least outlined in the jacket copy. And most of the book, perhaps damagingly, is working out what the consequences of this series of extraordinary things having happened. And so, as I say, the big and really stunning stuff is telegraphed in the jacket copy. And I can see why, in a sense, they needed to do that this was, I guess, a relatively new author and the big breakthrough book, and they wanted to make this sound as stunning as possible. And I can see why, arguably, it's fair game if it's not that far into the book.
Sorry, what book is that?
Read there, Eon.
Oh.
It does, I mean, even when I first read that book, 20, 30 years ago, I knew from what was around it, I can't remember from the jacket copy or from reviews, that these things would be coming up, and so when I got to them, it was less of a surprise than it should have been.
Did the jacket copy make clear that there would be a lot more? So were you
Yeah.
going in? Okay.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, there's the danger that, like with your trailer example, Gavin, that you might think that this is all, or going back to my Remain Unspoiled example, that you might think that this is all there is.
Yeah.
And so you might say, okay, well, I know the whole thing now, I don't need to read the book, or, that's not what I'm looking for. If it didn't hint that there would be more to it than whatever those were,
I mean,
that would be a problem.
Partly this is inflected by my personal view that the remaining 400 pages are not as interesting as a setup.
No, this is still privileging the notion that we read to be surprised.
No, I don't read to be surprised, but I'm assuming that my reading, I'd like my reading experience to be, if my reading experience is going to be different if I know what happens, and if I know significant things along the way. And sometimes I want that reading experience where I see all the blocks falling into place, or because I can't bear the tension and I want to know if I'm going to have to throw, I'm going to have to throw the book away. Sometimes, but sometimes, I want to be taken on a journey that the author maybe hoped I would be taken on, coming to it as a blank slate. And I think, those are all valid reactions. But I don't think a desire to remain unspoiled is necessarily about reading for surprise. I think it's about, if I know X thing happens 2/3 of the way in, it's going to warp the landscape of the book in my mind. It's like the gravity metaphor with the walls of the sheet. I'm always, am I leaning towards this now? And so I don't think it's necessarily a question about spoilers. It's a question about how I.
That sounds like a question of literary effect, where, in the sense of what is the writer trying to accomplish. And I think the problem with questions about spoilers is, if you're trying to achieve a certain emotional effect in the reader, a spoiler is one of the hardest things to control.
Yes.
Because it's out of the writer's hands.
Yes, and so you shouldn't depend on the power of shock. Of course, I agree with that. But I believe the author is dead. Going back to our murder mystery thing, the author is dead.
And the intentional fallacy is yes, is
yeah, but I can. So maybe not the author, maybe the book. The book is a thing, whatever. But there's. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going on too much.
Can I suggest an alternate model, which is not necessarily privileging quote reading for surprise, but very often people read to empathise with characters, and particularly characters who get viewpoints. And if you arrive at a particular piece of information before George Smiley finds out who the mole is or whatever, then you are in a certain sense denied a piece of empathy with them.
Anybody want to say anything before you open up to questions? Or any questions?
I don't know if we touched on this before I came in. Graham sort of skirted around an interesting point. Is it reasonable to argue that short stories often have to be spoilable because they depend on hunch, whereas a longer work, if it's spoilable, is weakened by the fact why should you take all this time just to find out this piece of information instead of the journey itself being an important part of the experience?
No?
I wouldn't see the distinction. I think you can have plot surprise-driven short stories and novels, and non-plot surprise-driven short stories and novels.
Yeah, I mean, if I tell you, sorry, Kim, go ahead.
No, I think I disagree with you. Short stories that are plot driven and are kind of big bang thing, they will disappear from our common currency very quickly. Those are not the stories that people.
Okay, but we just talked about the moderating.
I don't know that it's, but that it's not the big bang that makes the story. It's the acquiescence that makes the story.
Yes, hi. So I was intrigued by what Grant said about his partner and how she likes to read, she goes to the end and
That's Gavin.
Graham's partner or the
That's
possible-
Gavin's partner.
Gavin, sorry, Grant.
Yeah, I know, I do too.
Yeah.
And that's right.
As long as the wife doesn't do it, I guess. So I guess what I hear when I hear discussions of spoilers on Wikipedia or on this panel is a lot of discussion of what the reader expects and what the reader is entitled to, and I feel that can only be defined by the individual reader, and so that takes me to my point, which is an argument maybe that I'd like you to comment on, which is that spoiler thing, the concept of spoilers is really a capitalist conspiracy to drive plot-driven stuff and drive sales, because it really sort of came up first with that movie, where, if I may spoil it, right, there's a big ending about the gender of that particular character, and before that, it was like it was a much less big deal, right? And since then, it becomes constantly a theme about what the producers and the publishers really want to drive out of it. So that's
I see your point. It's like, well, you don't want to be spoiled. You got to go see this weekend.
yeah, and you have to capture it like at that moment of release, so that nobody else can ruin your water cooler experience.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think you came in before I proposed an enthusiastic consent model. But I mean, the other thing is that because of the flip side of this is it's the move away from everyone goes on opening night. That everything's available on Netflix or whatever. So I think it sort of cuts both ways. I mean, what you're saying I think is true, but a lot of, especially when it comes to books, I think I think people can have valid motivations that are, yeah, maybe they're going to influence somewhat, but I think there are other reasons as well.
Hi, just a comment. I'm somewhat tension averse, and sometimes I'm reading something like a murder mystery, and I go, oh my God, they're not going to kill the kid. I better, I have to skip to the back so I can reassure myself or prepare myself so I can bear to read the story.
Trigger warnings in fanfic is a huge, complicated issue, which I will be happy to get into after the panel briefly. But that's the kind of thing you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It will be interesting to see if trigger warnings move into metadata for fiction, since it's a college level discussion at the moment whether there should be trigger warnings for The Great Gatsby or Jane Eyre. I mean, the trigger warning list for Jane Eyre is amazing.
I haven't seen it. But I mean, the argument briefly is that in commercial fiction you have context, like jacket copying covers and things that give you an idea of sort of the darkness level of the thing you're getting into, whereas fic don't. Again, complicated issue.
I was going to talk about the complicated issue. I think I'm going to talk about it anyway, and moving back to the Stephen King thing, where I think he was complaining that people were complaining too much about getting spoilered, but at the same time, I can kind of vaguely see from a distance like a small part of that point, which is in reading criticism, like Graham's, you should expect a level of spoilerishness about other works because you have to talk about the context. And I can kind of see look, toughen up, people. If you want to read criticism, it's going to have this context. You have to deal with it to deal with it. But at the same time, I hate the just toughen up because I think it's a cop out in saying that. So I was wondering if you had any commentary on that.
Can I give a practical example of this?
Yeah.
I'm currently rather dauntingly writing an introduction to a new UK edition of Little Big, and a third of the way through Little Big, there's a really, really big change in life in terms of who it focuses on, in terms of when and where it takes place, and all that stuff. And it's a big shock when you run into it first. How explicitly should I deal with that in an introduction? I suppose one way around it is to be explicit about saying that there's a spoiler here. I'm currently tending to being more vague and evocative, nebulous, flowery, whatever you want to say.
That's a great adjective.
And saying, well, there's a thing. There's a thing there. You'll know it when you get to it.
We've gotten a stop warning. I would say if you have to ask a question, somebody as they come up the stage. Sorry to you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks very much.